New York City's 2019 rent stabilization law or rent control law had the opposite effect of what it was intended to do. And rather than making housing more affordable for tenants, actually incentivized landlords to just take their properties completely off of the market and leave them vacant, making affordable housing much harder to find and housing costs in New York skyrocket. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News.
I personally live in a 10-unit walk-up building in the East Village, and 4 of those apartments are vacant and have been vacant for over 5 years. Let's count them. Vacant. 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 All right, why is that? So essentially, a law was passed in 2017 for affordable rent, which I'm all for. Seriously, we all need a place to live. And essentially, so when someone moves out of a rent-stabilized unit, you cannot increase the price anymore. So in my building, there's an 85-year-old guy, he dies, the landlord can't increase the rent, doesn't renovate the apartment, and they're betting the law is going to change back. So it just sits vacant, taking an apartment away from a New Yorker. And just in the East Village, I know for a fact, there's over 4,000 vacant apartments. What's your take?
All right, so I shouldn't have to say anything about rent control. I've been going over rent control for a while now, and I think I've brought up almost every single one of the points of why it does not work. Okay, it disincentivizes people from wanting to actually rent their properties out, and actually, because of that, the number of affordable housing units decreases. Now, the 2019 rent stabilization law, what it did was it took away the ability for the landlords to actually raise rent between tenants, so they can make improvements, raise rents up, and recover some of the costs that were associated with the improvements that they made. So without that incentive, a lot of landlords are just saying to themselves, well, we're not going to make those improvements. We're not even going to rent these units. We're just going to leave them vacant. So like I said before, if you disincentivize landlords from, wanting to rent their units out, that will lead to a further affordable housing shortage and make it harder for tenants overall. The cost will skyrocket in those units that are not rent controlled. Okay? And this is exactly what we're seeing in New York right now. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think for the New York landlords on here. Okay? I've had many of them tell me, what they think of that 2019 rent stabilization law. Okay? But if you haven't already, in the comments, let it be known. Okay? I'm going to be going over the law for those landlords outside of New York, so they will know exactly, what it says in it and why it does not work. But it's pretty obvious. Any sort of rent control is not going to work. But this law in particular, it's even worse than normal. Anyway, let's get into this article. It's coming from businessinsider.com, and it says, why some New York City landlords keep the apartments you can actually afford off the market. Yeah, okay. And those landlords who still own rental properties, a lot of them are keeping those rent controlled units off the market. Some of them are selling them or converting them over to condos or co-ops so that they don't have to even, they're completely removed from the rental market. And the ones who own single family homes are selling them to owner occupants. Now, I know the single family in New York isn't covered under rent control, but the point is that they're just losing units. They're losing units. The number of rent-controlled units is decreasing. It is not increasing. It will never increase. Anyway, let's get into this article. New York is neck deep in a housing shortage, but there are thousands of vacant apartments that could be available to the city's renters if landlords would let them move in. Evan Rugen, the founder of real estate investment firm LVL Group NY, says a political fluke is allowing landlords to keep affordable units off the market. In a TikTok video that has more than 40,000 views, Rugen says a 2019 act that was created to protect affordable rent for New Yorkers has done the exact opposite. It all boils down to the elusive New York real estate dream, the rent-regulated apartment. New York's Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019 was created to strengthen rent control, regulate what happens to an apartment's price when a renter vacates, and ensure tenants can stay in their units for longer. The law repealed a former rule that allowed landlords of rent-regulated units to automatically raise rents up to 20% when they became unoccupied, limiting the renovation costs landlords could recoup by increasing rents. Today, this means that when a rent-stabilized unit becomes vacant, a landlord is less incentivized to replace the tenant. So yeah, in between tenants, they're not even talking about increasing the rent on the current tenant who's living in the unit. They're talking about increasing the rent on a tenant who has already moved out. I mean, on a unit where the tenant has already moved out. So let's say, for example, and I like to use just basic numbers. You have a rent of $1,000. Now I know that's low for New York or whatever, but I just like nice whole numbers for example's sake, right? So in between tenants, you're allowed to raise your rent beforehand. You were allowed to raise your rent by 20% to cover renovation costs for that unit. So you could raise it up to $1,200. But now with the new 2019 rent control law, you can't do that anymore. And it's going to be a lot harder to recover the renovation costs associated with tenant turnover. You're not going to want to upgrade that unit to, something nice and fancy, and, because you're never going to recover that money. So instead, what some landlords are doing is saying, hey, we're not even going to rent this unit out at all anymore. Other landlords are saying, well, we're just not going to do any upgrades, any repairs. We're going to, slap some duct tape on it just to make it functional enough to get a tenant in there, and that's it. So yeah, the housing quality of the housing stock is decreasing for those who still have units, and the ones who don't, they're searching for a needle in a haystack because the number of these rent controlled units is decreasing. And this is exactly what every economist and everyone who knows anything would have told them. But they have their heads stuck up their butts and they can't figure out basic common sense. This is easy to figure out, Okay, so it says, instead of keeping renting affordable, Rugen says the law has helped to drive rents in New York City to astronomical levels. This is because landlords realize their rent-stabilized units can't be listed at market rate after they invest in upgrades. So many have refrained from listing them at all as they wait for New York City housing laws to change. The Community Housing Improvement Program, an association of nearly 4,000 owners and managers of more than 400,000 rent-stabilized properties across New York City, estimates that out of the more than 1 million rent-stabilized apartments in New York City, 20,000 units remain vacant as costs prevent landlords from listing them. Yeah, I read about a story a few years back, right? And it actually said in it that there was a rent-controlled tenant who was living in this unit, and she had been there for something like 60 years, like some unbelievable amount of time, like since the 1950s, right? And her rent, and this was like from the articles from like 2017. Her rent in 2017 before she passed away was only like $500 a month. Okay, and she lived on, I believe it was in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, right? So very popular, very expensive area. So yeah, she lived in this rent-stabilized apartment for super cheap. So they actually had pictures from inside this apartment, and it was frightening inside because the place had not been upgraded in nearly 60 years. Why? What incentive is there for a landlord to upgrade this unit? Okay, what incentive? There's absolutely none. So with the new rent stabilization law that they passed in 2019, the landlord would look at this unit and say, hey, this unit is renting for, and I believe it was like a 2-bedroom too. So it was not, a small place, but the landlord can go in there and say, okay, I have to do 60 years worth of improvements, 60 years worth of upgrades for this rent stabilized tenant who died in there. And I'm only limited to some very small, minuscule percentage of rent increase for this unit, even after this tenant has passed away. So, you spend, let's say because the unit has been, occupied for so long, you're going to go in there and you have to spend 20 grand fixing it up. Well, how are you going to recover that 20 grand if the biggest rent increase you can have is like $25 a month? Okay? It's going to take you forever. And it's just not worth it. And the next tenant could do the very same thing, stay in that unit indefinitely, 20, 30, 40 years, not move out, and you're just stuck with them. So you know what these landlords are doing? They're just saying, screw it. I'm leaving it empty. I'm not going to occupy this unit. Nobody else is getting this sort of deal off of me, you know? It's just not happening. And that is what happens with rent control, okay? We have landlords purposefully holding properties off the market. Oh, man, it's a bad situation, but what do they expect landlords to do, okay? We get into this to make money, and you've taken away the ability to make money. So this is bound to happen. While it may seem more beneficial for landlords to rent out these units at a lower cost than to forego any income at all, Rugen says the hesitancy is based on tenant longevity. Simply put, if a tenant has a good deal on rent, they're less likely to move elsewhere, and the landlord may have to wait years to collect a higher rent. One of the biggest questions is $100 better than zero? Rugen said. Well, no, because a rent-stabilized tenant is very difficult to get out. Though the law was created to better protect tenants, it could inadvertently be making their lives more difficult. New York City's pool of new housing hasn't kept up with the population growth, and that means rental competition has become stiff. Yeah, and that's just what I just said, okay? And they said the exact same thing in the article. If the tenant's going to be in there for 20, 30, 40 years, you know, with this super low rent, then no, it's not cheaper, you know, it's not better to put somebody in there in some cases, okay? And, you know, I know that's not good, but the landlord is out for their own best interest. And if they think that there is a possibility that they could get this rent stabilization law removed, or somehow get some sort of exception within a few years, well, they can make up for all those losses in a very short period of time. And that's what some of these landlords are betting on. According to the real estate management company Douglas Elliman, bidding wars accounted for about 1 in 5 lease signings in Manhattan in May. In Brooklyn, it was 1 in 4 new signings. Median rents in these boroughs climbed by 25% and 18% from the same period in 2021. Without additional inventory, the Big Apple's housing shortage is likely to worsen, and that means rental prices will continue to climb. Yeah, well, here's the thing, okay? They are not going to be greatly increasing the amount of housing. They are not. Okay, there's too many rules, too many regulations, too many hoops to jump through. The cost of building in New York is extremely high. And basically the amount of affordable housing is not going to increase to meet the needs of the people who are there even right now, much less the number of people who want to move in and find affordable housing. So yeah, this was really created by the socialist systems, by rent control, by the bureaucracy. All of this was created by that, by not allowing developers to build, by not allowing landlords to rent units out and make money, and by trying to control everything. This is the end result.